Hello and welcome to Spark at the London Stock Exchange. I'm Katya Gorbatyuk, Head of Investment Funds at the London Stock Exchange, and today we will be discussing governance and stewardship, and in particular, what's next for the codes and best practice. A number of market reforms are set in motion in the UK, aimed at streamlining access to capital for public and private companies to strengthen their competitiveness and the appeal of the UK capital markets internationally. The depth of relationships between companies and their investors, the quality of dialogue is at the heart of the success of our markets. And this puts our corporate governance code and our stewardship codes and the related areas of best practice in the spotlight. To discuss the latest developments in policy and best practice, I'm delighted to be joined today by the following panel. Dr. Roger Barker, Director of Policy and Corporate Governance at the Institute of Directors, that plays a big role in elevating the standards of corporate governance. I'm also joined today by Paul George, partner at Board Excellence, an international board consultancy and advisory practice, and an expert in assessing board effectiveness. And I'm also joined by Victoria Sant, managing director at the Investor Forum that facilitates collective engagement between institutional investors and UK-listed companies, putting stewardship at the heart of the value creation. And finally, I'm joined today by Marcus Stoddart, Head of UK Primary Markets and AIM at the London Stock Exchange. And also he's joining in his capacity as a member of the Capital Markets Industry Task Force, launched to convene the City of London and the listed and private company ecosystem around the shared objective, strengthening the UK capital markets and driving investment into the real economy. This session is being recorded and will be available on the London Stock Exchange's Spark platform. And it's designed to be an interactive session, so we encourage the audience to ask questions through the function at the top right-hand side of your screen. So with that, I would like to turn to Paul. Paul, from your recent work reviewing the effectiveness of boards, as boards discharge their duties in promoting the success of the company, what do you see as the biggest emerging challenges to effective governance?
Thank you, Katya. Sorry about that. It took a while to unmute. Clearly there's a lot of challenges facing businesses at the moment in terms of the economic climate, the geopolitical situation, but focusing particularly on corporate governance. I think, as has been the case for many years, the biggest challenges facing boards is the speed of change and the changing and increasing expectations of what is expected of an effective board. Most of the boards we engage with want to do the right thing. They turn to us because they don't necessarily know what good looks like, or certainly what best practice is at any particular moment in time. And also they're looking for advice on how best to tackle challenges that perhaps others have already faced. We look at board effectiveness in quite a simplistic way to start with, in terms of an effective board, as far as I'm concerned, requires the right people with the right attitude, looking at the right issues with the right information at the right time. And when we review boards, and we see many very, very good boards, but we do see challenges in each of those areas, and some of them in multiple areas for individual boards. Perhaps I give you a little bit of a snapshot against each of those. As far as the right people's concerned, I think one of the biggest challenges that many boards are facing at the moment is getting the balance right in terms of composition, both for an overall size perspective, because large boards can be a restriction towards agility, but they also need the breadth of skills to populate the various different committees they've got and the various different business challenges that they face. And getting that balance between size, skill set, appropriate diversity is quite challenging. And many boards we find also struggle to get effective succession plans in place. They all have plans to some degree, but actually getting a real effective succession plan where they're really looking at the purpose of the organization, the strategy to deliver that purpose, and then the skill sets they need within the board in order to be successful, and measuring that up against the current composition and upcoming retirements is always a challenge. And a third area in terms of people is skill sets, and where can the boards turn to in order to continually enhancing their skill sets in order that they can continue to meet the challenges of today. As far as attitude is concerned, I think the key issues there are really around getting the right level of independence, and we might talk about the QCA code in a moment. Getting the balance right between support and challenge of the executives, and also making sure that they properly understand the dividing line between oversight, which is what the non-executives do, and management, which is what the executives do. And many organizations find that a particular struggle. So far as right issues are concerned, I think we find most boards are very good at looking backwards. They're very good at measuring and overseeing past performance and how the business is delivering against a budget or a plan. Perhaps less good at being more strategic and looking forward, horizon scanning, and the like. As far as right time's concerned, I think what we often see, and I think is a particular challenge for executives, is knowing when best to engage with their non-executives. Too often we see executives coming to boards with a fully worked out plan, right up against the deadline of when something needs to be executed, and then wondering why they don't get the approvals that they're looking for. And therefore, engaging with the board and the non-executives at an early stage to make sure that they're involved in the shaping really does help the whole process. Surprisingly, most boards are not good at teeing up the debate through effective papers. And we see too many examples of board packs which are far too long, far too unwieldy, not focusing in on the right issues, and perhaps don't properly set up the discussion, don't signpost what they're really looking for from the board. What is the key decision they're looking for? What processes that have the executive been through? Why have they reached the particular conclusion they have? Why have they rejected other potential solutions? Is often not done well, and we've spent quite a lot of time coaching executive teams on how best to set up the debate, which is all important about getting an effective decision. I'll stop there for the moment. I'm sure we can come back to some of those areas in due course if there's time.
Thank you, Paul. I would like to turn to Roger next, because we're going through the time of significant changes. So I would like to ask you, how have the recent changes in the government policy have affected the corporate governance landscape? And how is the FRC responding to this new policy mindset and to some of the challenges that Paul touched on?
Well, thank you, Katya. It's great to be here today, and very interesting to hear what Paul had to say. I used to do a lot of board evaluations myself, so what he was saying really rang true to me. But on the policy side of things, let me perhaps just recap where we are in the corporate governance policy journey. Now, you may not remember this now because it seems to be fading into distant history, but immediately before the pandemic, we were reeling from a number of corporate collapses. Carillion, Thomas Cook, Patisserie Valerie, BHS. I mean, they all had different causes, different reasons why they collapsed, but there were some common features. And weak board oversight was one of the problems, poor risk management, misleading corporate reporting, ineffective auditing, and the regulators didn't really cover themselves in glory either. And there was a moment when these were really impacting on public opinion and causing a lot of mistrust in business. And after that, there came some significant investigations in terms of what went wrong. One of the big ones was undertaken by the chairman of the London Stock Exchange at the time, Sir Donald Brydon. There's another one from Sir John Kingman, who's now chairman of Legal and General, parliamentary reports. So huge investigation into this. And the government sort of responded, and the Secretary of State made very clear that he was committed to reforming corporate governance and the audit regime as recently as 2021. But I think, when we look at the situation now, we've had the pandemic, obviously, but the policy environment has fundamentally changed. And it seems to me that the components of the reform package are really starting to unravel. The first sort of problem, which has been apparent for some time, is that the government has not been able to find, despite being committed to it, it hasn't been able to find time, parliamentary time, to introduce legislation to convert the FRC into AGA. The second blow is much more recent. It came last month when the government decided that it was going to withdraw the new reporting requirements, despite having only introduced them into Parliament in July. So, this was actually a major shock that they were pulled, because I think a lot of the business community had been preparing for them. It had been assuming that they were going to be going ahead. Then we had the situation just a few weeks ago on the 9th of November, when the FRC announced that it wasn't going to move forward with various changes to the UK Corporate Governance Code, which it had been consulting on over the summer. So it decided it wasn't going to go ahead with changes to the role of audit committees in terms of ESG reporting, although it's still going ahead with its proposals on internal control. So we're going to see actually a new UK Corporate Governance Code announced in January, with far fewer of its original proposals in place. And I have to say, all the time that I've been involved working in corporate governance, I've never seen such a rowback from the FRC in terms of its proposals for the UK Corporate Governance Code. In the past, maybe it will have adjusted a few things, but this is pretty unprecedented. So I suppose the question then is, where does this all leave us? And I'm speaking from two perspectives. As a representative of the IoD, as an organisation which represents business, we don't want to see an excessive burden placed on directors and on businesses. And we were critical of a number of the changes that were proposed for the code. And our members regularly make the point to us that the overall corporate reporting burden is very significant, overly complex, and something really needs to be done about it. And I must say, we were also never very convinced about the viability of what the government was proposing to boost competition in the audit market, namely to have managed share audits involving Big Four and challenger firms working together. However, the other part of my remit at the IoD, and which we're tasked by the Royal Charter to really care about, are standards of corporate governance. So I suppose my thinking at the moment is, yes, some of the proposed reforms that were put forward did go too far, but let's be careful now not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, the UK has a hard-won, strong reputation for high standards of governance. So the question is, how do we find the right balance? We've got a situation where I think it's a bit of a mess. The UK business community has been walked up the hill in terms of audit and corporate governance reform. Now it's sort of being walked back down against it again. So this isn't very good, I think, for business stability. It doesn't engender confidence in the policy process, in a stable and secure policy process. And one prominent business journalist just a couple of weeks ago contacted me and said, what is driving this change? Is there some kind of Svengali secret advisor at the heart of governance, which is government, which is pushing them to do all this stuff that we don't know anything about? Well, I think the answer to that actually can be seen in the letter that the Capital Markets Industry Task Force sent, Katya, to the Chancellor on the 16th of November. And this obviously reflects big concerns in the City of London about the challenges of attracting listings to London. And only yesterday, the Secretary of State for Business, Kemi Badenoch, wrote to the FRC mandating the FRC to take into account competitiveness as one of its key objectives. And it was very interesting for me to read the interview that Richard Moriarty, the new CEO of the FRC, did in the Financial Times recently, which really did suggest a change of tone from the FRC in terms of avoiding an excessive burden of regulation. However, I do think, though, that, as I said before, we do need to be careful in this process. There is one sentence in the Capital Markets Industry Task Force letter, which I just wanted to pull out and perhaps query. And that is where it says, quote, "As a fundamental principle, UK-listed companies should not be subject to requirements companies listed on other high-quality exchanges are not subject to." Now, I think we need to be clear here that the UK's corporate governance regime is distinctive from other regimes. It's distinctive from the US's corporate governance regime. You know, we have a regime which is centered around the Corporate Governance Code, which is applied on the basis of comply or explain. The US doesn't have this. And the US system is arguably less flexible, more driven by regulators and regulation, like the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. And I think that this lighter touch approach that we have in the UK is a competitive advantage for the UK. And if you're asking the question, what is causing fewer companies to list in London compared to other jurisdictions? I think, that's a complicated debate. We probably don't have time here to get into that in detail, but I don't think that it's our corporate governance regime that's the main problem, although it is a tempting scapegoat. So I do have a bit of a problem with the argument that the UK should give up any kind of leadership role in corporate governance and simply follow what other jurisdictions are doing. However, I do completely agree that in view of what's happened recently, we need to really regroup in terms of corporate governance policy. We do need to have a fundamental rethink about corporate reporting. What is it there to do? Who's it for? And also we need to think again, I think, about how we regulate audit. Now, whether these questions are going to be priorities for policymakers ahead of the next general election is an open question, or whether even there'll be a priority after the next general election. But we are in a bit of a mess, and so we do, I think, really need to have a relook at these things.
Thank you for these comments, Roger. It's a perfect opportunity to bring in Marcus in terms of just hearing his insights into the feedback from the listed issuer ecosystem on the governance requirements in the UK, and how this determines the choice of a jurisdiction for them to live in and to grow and scale, and the choice of a capital raising venue, and what was the impetus for forming the Capital Markets Industry Task Force.
Katja, thank you. So I'm primarily speaking today sort of in my capacity as head of UK primary markets at London Stock Exchange, rather than as any kind of CMIT representative. But I think there's a lot of agreement, and actually I'd agree with quite a lot of what both Paul and Roger have said about this being it being a good opportunity to just take stock and have a relook at where we're heading, and that's certainly consistent with the feedback that we've heard from a lot of issuers. Roger just sort of mentioned corporate governance being a part of the reasons that companies choose to go public or stay private, and there's clearly a much wider reform agenda going on at the moment, and corporate governance is just part of that. But I think what's been really helpful over the last 2 or 3 years has been the quality of debate about regulation, and whether that's as part of the primary markets effectiveness review of the main market, whether that's Jonathan Hill's review of the listing regime. I think there has been a quality of discussion that we haven't seen probably for a couple of decades, where people have really been standing back and having a grown-up conversation about which bits of regulation do we genuinely care about? What is the regulation? What's the disclosure that is actually ultimately building investor confidence, and as a result of that is increasing valuations, liquidity, reducing the cost of capital for issuers? And I think that's what we all ultimately want to achieve. I think the some of the challenges and some of the feedback that we've had back from issuers is that, the comply or explain regime that Roger just talked about, I think we've lost our way a bit in the UK. And I think, if you talk to a lot of issuers, they don't genuinely feel that they can explain. I think, a lot of companies feel that, we're now in a bit of a comply or else environment, and that boards spend a lot of time evaluating, what they think investors are going to require of them, rather than thinking about the governance, the remuneration requirements that are right for the business at its stage of growth, operating in a genuinely global market. And I've had a number of examples of large companies that have said to me, look, we operate in a global market where, for example, we are paying our head of research significantly more than we're paying our CEO, because that is the going rate to hire the right talent to grow and develop this business in the interest of shareholders. But we don't feel that we could match that level of pay for our CEO or our CFO, because we think that will just incur votes against our remuneration policy. And they're examples, I think, of how companies don't feel that they can explain, that they have to comply. And I think the other really important thing for us to consider is not just this as a code that applies solely to the public markets, and that all of this reform agenda is just about increasing or retaining listings. We've got a real opportunity in the UK to make sure that not only the funding continuum, but the sort of this disclosure continuum, if you like, from startup to IPO is joined up and there aren't cliff edges. And I've long said to private companies, when they're thinking about their corporate governance requirements, they should think about what is genuinely right for the business and what helps the business grow and will make it sustainable over the long term, rather than just ticking boxes and doing what they think public market investors will expect to see. And so I think this is an opportunity for everyone to step back and say, what are the components that we genuinely care about that is going to help companies retain the right talent, grow, have the right checks and balances, and that's also going to improve the quality of dialogue between investors and boards. Because I think the other element that is coming out quite strongly is, because of many decades of very well-intentioned regulation, actually we've come to a very complex situation now where in some of the bigger fund managers, the actual portfolio managers are having to sort of in a way outsource to their internal governance teams or to third-party agencies some of the voting and the analysis. And I think that is also leading to more of a comply or else regime, rather than the portfolio managers who are making the investment decisions actually having a proper quality, substantive discussion with boards. And so, I completely get that we need some certainty and we need some consistency. But I do think we've got a unique opportunity to really look at the corporate governance arrangements that are going to serve the UK economy well for the coming decades.
Thank you, Marcus. I would like to come back to Paul for just a quick reaction to everything that's been said so far, especially as the boards consider the recent policy developments, the consultation, then yesterday's remit letter by the Secretary of State for Business and Trade. And so what's, in your sense, the trajectory of the change that boards need to consider?
Well, first of all, just comment a little bit on Roger's comments, which I thought did a very good recollection of what's been going on over the last 6 or 7 years in corporate governance regulation around corporate reporting audit. I'd go back a few months earlier than that, and when I was still at the FRC, I was amazed how quickly ministers went from, could you come up with a list of deregulatory measures, Paul, to when are you going to shoot a director for the fact that some company has failed? And I think one of the points that really drove home to me, and I think perhaps events of the last few days probably emphasized it further, which is the FRC operates better when it is clearly independent from government. Because I think having corporate governance and reporting and audit as a political football of where people are going to, and who would have thought that corporate governance would be a vote catcher, but I don't necessarily think that's the right thing. And I think that the FRC should have sufficient independence within a framework that they can plot a steady course that perhaps they were renowned for 10, 15 years ago. I absolutely agree with what Mark has said around comply or else. I sit on a couple of boards as an audit committee chair and SID, and the conclusion, we're very small companies and therefore we don't have as much access to investors as some, but it's just too difficult to do anything other than do what we think the proxy advisors will actually come up with. So I do think we need to look at that regime. Companies need to be held to account. Investors are the ones there that are doing the heavy lifting, alongside obviously the non-execs, but we've got to get that to work properly. The whole underlying ethos of the Corporate Governance Code was, here are some principles, make sure you deliver those principles, but actually the precise way in which you get there through the provisions has a degree of flexibility that best suits the arrangements that your organisation faced in a particular time. So I think we need to depoliticise corporate governance and reporting, and we need the debate that Marcus has been talking about to flow through, so that all sides of the debate have a good opportunity to air their views on where the level and burden of regulation should fall, and then an independent body should determine what the outcome should be.
Thank you, Paul. And so I would like to make full use of Marcus's time because he does have an urgent commitment. And before he goes, I would like to ask you, Marcus, about the feedback that you get from the same ecosystem on the dynamic, the development or in the development of the dialogue between boards and their investors, and what are some of the areas that CMIT proposes to address in that dialogue?
Yeah, so actually, going back against one of the points that Roger made about the need to really sort of make sure that we've got good levels of trust between business and society. I think, actually corporate governance has got a really important role to play to highlight sort of success, and when companies, the majority of whom are doing the right thing and are trying to do the right thing. I think the problem, though, with this sort of comply or else sort of situation that we found ourselves in by sort of default and by stealth, is that it's set up quite a kind of combative relationship in a way between companies and their investors, where, because of the stewardship code, investors, I think, feel a need to demonstrate that they're being active stewards by publishing the number of times that they don't agree with the board. And so it's sort of twisted what should be a positive relationship on its head. And so I think we need to kind of get back to where we were with sort of genuine sort of comply or explain. And that's certainly what we're hearing back from companies. So the letter that the Capital Markets Industry Task Force published, and that was signed by 50 odd other people yesterday, has really called for that review to get back, whether it's comply or explain or apply or explain, however you want to describe it, but to get back in a way to where we were, and to really have that debate about which of the corporate governance provisions that we genuinely care about, and that add value. And to the point about international competitiveness, that's not just about the competitiveness of stock exchanges and listed markets. It's about the competitiveness of the businesses themselves that are operating in a truly global market for talent. And so I think that's why there's a sort of call for a globally competitive approach to things, and that we shouldn't just in order to sort of feel and demonstrate that we are thought leaders, always be adding additional layers of disclosure and compliance on top of what's already there. And I think given the wider reform agenda, and given the focus on trying to get our investors and our pension funds to really increase their exposure to equities, we are at a point where we really do have a unique opportunity to really get the markets motoring again. And that's not just the public markets, but it's also the private markets. We've got, if we really take a step back, we are in a very fortunate position in the UK that we have got some of the best levels of innovation, some of the highest levels of sort of unicorn creation and scale-ups. We've got one of the biggest pension fund industries in the world, and we need to just combine those and get them back, and companies and investors talking together again in a collaborative, long-term way, so that we can generate jobs, growth, and wealth in the UK.
Thank you, Marcus. Victoria, you've been so patient with us, and I would like to turn next to you to talk about the investor side of things, to talk about the pressures that investors are facing, and how, what are the priorities of the asset owners, and how do these translate into the asset managers' approach to stewardship, and what are the resulting voting outcomes and impact on the investee companies?
Yes, sure. Thank you. I would like to put that case for the investors, because I think they are caught in the middle between wanting to invest in successful companies that generate value. They've got to meet the expectations and reporting requirements of their own regulator, and then they've got their client expectations, and some of these can be quite competing at the moment. And when we look at the stewardship regulators group that the FRC has put together, you can see how many parties are involved in stewardship. You've got obviously the FRC and Department for Trade and Business and Treasury, got the FCA and the PRA, the Local Government Association, the DWP, the pensions regulator, all of these parties articulating their expectation of various parts of the chain. And investors are kind of interpreting that. And obviously the client is one of the biggest drivers of what they do. So the actions by the DWP to put onto pension funds in the UK, 99% of savers caught by these rules, their investment disclosure and regulations of 2019, which required a much clearer articulation of your ESG policy and beliefs, and an annual reporting in your implementation statement of how you've aligned with these policy statements and describe your voting behaviour, has just upped, I think, the scrutiny on investment managers of what they're having to do. Much more a market for stewardship, which is great, but much more scrutiny, an explicit mandate to be harder, to be tougher, to live up to the labels of some of these funds that people have bought into, and to fill in the reporting requirements from the PLSA or the investment consultants. And these are scrutinised by people. So it was mentioned that a vote against is seen as a sign of good stewardship. I think it is a differentiator. There's an expectation that investors will be holding companies to account and being a tool for policy in that sense. But we've seen that the asset owners maybe have a slightly different agenda to other people on the call. The fair reward framework that the Church of England is consulting on at the moment actually is quite different from what CMIT has come up with. And the report from the Asset Owners Stewardship Review really identified a cultural misalignment between especially UK-based asset owners and non-UK-based asset managers. So that friction perhaps in the market is going to continue, where investors are feeling the pressure from their clients to pass on that more combative relationship and to disclose more, to be more transparent about what they're doing. And that requirement for transparency is taking a lot of resources out of the system as well. So much energy going into reporting and disclosing what you're doing, that you don't actually have time to do the job anymore to an extent. And so I think a lot of corporate governance teams are feeling really squeezed if we want to go back and have those conversations with companies, but we've got so much reporting to do that our resources are being directed in a slightly different way. And I think our members especially, have that willingness to have that nuanced conversation with companies, to understand, to accept those explanations. But where their clients have come up with principles-based voting rules or have taken back control of their voting, I think with that disconnect between the vote and the engagement, companies might feel even more pressure on them that it is just kind of that tick box. But we're very much aligned that good corporate governance does create value, and I think asset owners are seeing that as well, and investors have a role to play in the whole system, but they are under a lot of pressure too, all sides.
Thanks, Victoria. So if I may go back to you again, so what does the Investor Forum want to see from the FRC's planned review of the stewardship code next year, and what are the particular aspects that you feel need addressing there?
Yeah, so I think that the role of transparency and simplifying data reporting is something that we'd really like to see. At the moment, there's loads of places that investors have to disclose, and I think centralising that in the stewardship code would be really helpful. We do want to see collective engagement remain a core principle. I think that's important given what's going on in the US and elsewhere in the world, that investors are getting a bit more nervous about how they exercise their stewardship. And I think the UK has been really good in the past of giving that permission, being explicit and empowering their investment managers to work together. So we'd like to see that. And I think it's a really good opportunity, as others have said, to kind of sit back and think, well, what is just creating bureaucracy for the sake of it? Are there other venues that this could happen? But how can we showcase what we're doing? How can we evidence that we are being good stewards and kind of retaining some of that good practice?
Thank you. Paul, I would like to ask you about the QCA governance code that has come out. What's your view of the changes that you see there?
Thank you. First thing I say is I've always been a great fan of the QCA code, despite my involvement in the 2018 UK Corporate Governance Code. And I think it really did set quite a good balance in terms of principles and regulation and so forth. I feel a bit sorry for the QCA, actually, in that they've just issued their revised code in the last month or so, probably about 3 weeks ago. Just at the time the government was making its announcements that it was railing back on its legislative agenda underpinning corporate governance, and the FRC said they were rowing back on many of the provisions that they were consulting on in the UK Corporate Governance Code. So you've got a situation where the QCA code has been revised. It's been strengthened considerably in a number of areas at a time when the pendulum is flowing in a slightly different direction. So I think that's going to present a bit of a challenge to the QCA. I still think it's a good code. I think there's if you read the revised code, you can see the dilemma that was facing those that were drafting it, because you've got some strong suggestions in one sentence, and then the following sentence, it effectively says, well, you don't have to do that. So an example might be in terms of independence. There is a clear statement in there about the importance of independence on the board, clear statement that organizations should have a board which has at least as many independent directors as non-independent directors. And then the next sentence, or a couple of sentences later, it says, oh, and by the way, you should, as a minimum, you should have 2 independent non-executive directors. So so the users of that code are getting the strong encouragement that they should have an equal number of independent non-executive directors, but then on the other hand, can lean on a further sentence which says, but as a minimum, you must have 2. And so I think there's a little bit of, there's 2 or 3 others in that regard. Around voting, there's a number of suggestions around annual elections for directors, remuneration policy, where the QCA code is really giving a nod to the direction that they think companies should go in, without actually saying you really must do that. And so so I think it's going to be quite challenging for companies to follow it. It's going to be very interesting to see where there are sentences which give a nod to something but don't necessarily push it fully through, the extent to which investors and advisors what approach they adopt. And you know, hopefully it will create good engagement and a good debate, as opposed to a tick box approach where companies can't do what they think is the right thing for their particular circumstances.
Thank you, Paul. So, Roger, it's undoubted, it cannot be doubted that boards are facing volatile environment, and they need to exist in it, and they need to promote the success of the company against all these conditions. You have just come out with a paper about, you know, asking the question: are boards really losing control? So, could you tell us more about it? Are boards losing control, in fact?
Yes, well, this was quite a provocative title for a piece of thought leadership. Are boards losing control? But I think it ties in with some of the things that, in particular, Marcus was talking about, and it certainly reflected the sentiment of many directors that we spoke to. I mean, part of this is, of course, about the regulatory burden on boards and companies, which is just in a sort of long-term trend of increasing on many fronts. And the sentiment that comes from board members is that they feel that there is this gradual restriction of the ability of boards to run their companies and to set their strategic direction in a way that they would consider would be in the company's best interest. And part of it, I think, is the sheer volume of regulation. And this leads boards to focus a lot on compliance. They spend less time, you know, talking about strategy, innovation, and other performance-related matters. And it tends to lead them to become more risk-averse in general. But others stress that it's not just the volume of regulation that's changed, but the nature of that regulation. And with their feeling is that much new regulation is somehow political, in inverted commas, in motivation. And that these type of requirements, you know, they're quite polarizing. They evoke strong feelings in people both within and outside of the company. And boards and companies find themselves in the middle of this debate. But it's not just actually regulation that makes boards think that they maybe are losing control. It's also the sheer weight of external challenges and developments, geopolitical developments, and others. Like, I mean, you can think of a long list of them recently: the pandemic, Brexit, war in the Middle East, how the company, you know, responds to climate change. How does the board sort of deal with technology, AI, all of these kind of issues? And I suppose what directors told us was that they're just catching boards on the back foot. Boards are kind of stuck in reactive mode. And the problem with that is it leaves a bit of a vacuum at the top of business, which is being filled by regulators, investors, proxy advisors, and other influencers who think they know best how companies should be run, but whose priorities are not necessarily always fully aligned with that of a company. And this does become a problem to boards when these demands and expectations are increasingly prescriptive around how a company should be run, that actually start to encroach on what boards see as the rightful responsibility of the board itself. Problem with that is it blurs decision-making and accountability. Now, I don't necessarily have any easy answers to these issues. I mean, this was I think it was a piece of thought leadership designed to provoke debate rather than provide any easy answers. But let me just offer a few which come from the paper. And the first is that, you know, it should be a thinking behind any kind of regulation that we need to maintain to sustain the ability of boards to take the right decisions for the company. I mean, the whole point of board governance is that directors are well placed. They're actually better placed than other stakeholders to make the right decisions for their company. You know, they have the access to information, expertise, and they have the right legal obligations to do the right thing for the company. And that's why really principles-driven regulation should be preferred whenever possible, because it does sustain that ability of directors to exercise their own judgment. Secondly, and this touches on something Marcus was saying, boards need to be more robust in defense of their governance arrangements, you know, and if they feel that investors or proxy advisors are telling them to do the wrong thing, they do need to stand up for themselves. You know, there is not a one-size-fits-all approach to governance, and boards need to stand up for that. And I think another recommendation is that because governance is becoming so politicized, should political awareness be part of the skills profile of a board member? And do boards have the right sort of access to skills, resources of, you know, informed corporate affairs advisors who can help them for example, to take an active role in public debates when maybe the board feels that the public have got the wrong end of the stick and they don't really understand the contribution that business is making. I mean, ultimately, the challenge for boards is to demonstrate that they're capable of being trusted, that they're going to run their companies in a responsible and a professional way. Because if they don't do that, then other stakeholders, other interests are going to impose requirements upon them. And just as a final point, it's been the IoD's view for a long time that directors need to go further in terms of thinking about adopting professional qualifications or some kind of training prerequisite prior to becoming a director. Being a director shouldn't just be seen as the next step in an executive career. It's a qualitatively different governance role. And I know that many large company directors wouldn't want to subject themselves to professional development. They may see themselves as the finished article. But I think it's ultimately a much better solution to professionalize the board role and win trust and promote best practice that way, than rather simply being subject to an increasing and ever-growing burden of regulation just imposed on boards, which just over time, it just shrinks the contribution of the director and exposes him or her to ever more legal liability and complexity. So that would be my plea.
Thanks, Roger. So the next question is for all the panelists. So I would like to reiterate that there is now a specific emphasis on competitiveness within the FRC statutory objective of promoting growth. So when it comes to codes and best practice, how does one strike the right balance between driving the standards and preserving and enhancing the UK's position as a leading capital market, which can enable more companies to thrive and stay in the UK? Perhaps Paul first.
Well, I think that's the golden nugget that we're looking to the FRC and the financial regulators to deliver. I think the only way that you're going to achieve that is with the right people being involved with the FRC at its various different levels. So if I focus on the FRC aspect rather than the financial regulators, so you need high quality people engaged within the organisation. You need appropriate dialogue with all of the different agents with an interest in effective governance and reporting and how businesses operate. And you need the FRC to be allowed to balance off those various inputs that they might get, including inputs from ministers and the like, but should be free then to exercise their independent judgment, saying, having heard all of the arguments, this is what we think is the right thing to do. it's there's as many academic articles which will tell you about the benefits of regulation in terms of access to capital and how more governance regulation leads to more effective companies, which leads to growth because businesses perform better, as there are that will tell you exactly the opposite, because boards are so engrossed in looking at all of the different bits of legislation, they forget to oversee the development of a strategy to capture opportunities in a new market. So it's a difficult one, but I think the only way you're going to do it is having the right people with access to good debates from a variety of different sources, and then the ability to take decisions free from political interference.
Thanks, Paul. Victoria?
Yes, so I don't think we want to see a bonfire of investor protections. I think that there are certain things that have been established through all these codes that are absolutely worth preserving, and we need to foster and enhance those positive attributes. And I think, good governance, as I said, done well, does create value, and we're all aligned around value creation. I think Paul's right that getting all the voices in the room, because the asset owners, I think, they're not going to support unbridled capitalism at the expense of planet and society. That they have a role here in that kind of systemic stewardship, and I think that voice of just kind of making sure that they're heard and their concerns are reflected in the codes as they come through is going to be important, because, like I said, they are the clients of the asset managers at the end of the day, and the investors are kind of accountable to them as much as they want kind of a thriving market. So I agree, the voices in the room are important, but it's a great time to have a debate and to kind of have that reset on things.
Thank you, Roger. And maybe in your answer, there is one question from the audience that I'm keen for you to cover. And that question is about the possibility of a government change, and whether that will create any changes in the current thinking.
Yes. Well, the first part of my answer would be, let's not panic here. I don't think that the UK corporate governance regime is fundamentally flawed. We should be proud in the UK of where we've come from in terms of governance, and we shouldn't be throwing that away. The Corporate Governance Code, I think, is an excellent sort of central part of our governance. I think we were right to slightly rebalance things in the light of what the Hill review was saying, to improve the attractiveness of London for founders, for founding companies. I think actually in the past, perhaps the UK has been a bit too investor-oriented, if I dare say that, as a governance destination, and perhaps slightly less attractive as an issuer destination. So I think it was reasonable to slightly adjust that. But I think, in general, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with where we are in terms of our governance regime. In terms of your second question about a future government, we don't really know the answer to that to any significant extent. I mean, of course, we don't have manifestos yet ahead of an election. Whether something about corporate governance would even make it into a party political election manifesto, I doubt. There hasn't been prominent in previous manifestos. We have heard, bits and pieces coming from the Labour Party. So, for example, Ed Miliband, when he was Shadow Business Secretary, seemed to support our proposal, which was to reform Section 172 of the Companies Act, slightly create more of a sort of balanced stakeholder orientation in terms of directors' duties within the Companies Act. More recently, Jonathan Reynolds, who's now the Shadow Business Secretary, I hear, please don't quote me on this, but I understand that he is looking at the issue of purpose in business. That might be something that Labour Party is looking at. I'm not sure how they're planning to take that forward. But Jonathan Reynolds has, though, said that he does plan to move ahead with legislation to create ARGA, but he hasn't said yet when that would happen. It probably, therefore, wouldn't be maybe the first priority of a new government. But he has shown some degree of commitment to taking forward that reform.
Thank you. And then the final round of comments that I would like to elicit is around about the change in the dialogue between investors and corporate boards, about the evolution of mutual expectations. So perhaps Victoria, starting with you, what are some of the strategies for enhancing the quality and the depth of the dialogue that aligns interests and unlocks the much needed capital to underpin economic recovery, growth, innovation, and job creation?
Yes, so we were really excited to see in the CMIT letter yesterday the recommendation that an investor and issuer forum is created, so that there is a body responsible for kind of having that debate with the industry leaders and doing that. And the investor forum, I think, can evolve into that role and play a role in making sure that we're focused on, as you said, the things that we have in common rather than things that draw us apart, and focus on valuations and value creation, sustainable value creation. So I think that would be valuable. I think investors have had less of a problem with dialogue, I think, than companies. They don't have a problem with access. Access to UK boards is, well, you know, the best in the world because of the corporate governance codes that we've had and that cultural evolution of engagement. But there is an acknowledgement, I think, that we do need a venue and a kind of a reset in that conversation, and to make sure that the voices are sensibly moderated.
Thank you. Roger?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think first of all, just to say, I think the investor forum is essential and does a really good job, because, you know, there is still a problem in terms of bringing companies, boards, and investors together. It's just inherent in the system that we have. You know, large scale institutional ownership, a lot of outsourced asset management. You know, very diverse portfolios of shares that asset managers hold, and the difficulties that creates for engagement. You know, it used to be better, I think, in the old city days, when there was kind of a closer dialogue, but it could be a lot worse. I mean, we could be in the US situation where there's very little dialogue, and investors just tend to sue the directors, you know, if they lose money, using securities legislation. So, you know, that's really confrontational stuff. So yeah, we need to bring investors and companies together, and it's just going to, I think it's just going to be you know, hard, good day-to-day work, and a positive attitude on both sides.
Thank you. Paul?
I'm not sure there's much to add. I mean, I think there are some good avenues, and the investor forum is very good at this, at bringing different groups together to discuss this. But I think from a corporate perspective, and what I hear is that it's not so much holistic discussions, it's actually getting and I think Victoria hinted at this, that from an investor perspective, they tend to get access to boards when they want access to boards, because if your major investor calls you call them back. I think it's a lot harder, particularly for small entities, to be able to get such ready access the other way around, and therefore whatever dialogue we want to develop, and I think there's already good mechanisms there, we need to make sure that it operates at both a holistic level and is cost effective and works at a individual entity level, as well.
Thank you, Paul. If I may sum up, this is the time of change in the UK capital markets, the change to pave the way for the international competitiveness of the companies listed in our markets, as well as our markets themselves, and the quest for good standards and the need to foster a globally competitive capital market in the UK should not be an either or, as both contribute to the abilities for companies to raise high quality capital that they need to create jobs and to grow. And at the crux of this big aspiration is the genuine and high quality dialogue between businesses and investors. So I would like to thank all of you, Victoria, Paul, Roger, and Marcus, to this great panel, for all your insights into all the different ways that the wheels of change can be set in motion. And thank you to our audience for joining us today.
Thank you, Katya.
Thank you.